Thank you very much indeed, and it's a real privilege to be here today. And I should say we've had a bit of a back and forth over what to call me, actually, because when I agreed to do this event, this wonderful event, it was almost 6 months ago, and I was still director of ODI. And I made it very clear that my term was coming to an end at the end of March this year. But the organisers very kindly said, no, you'll still do come along. But we did have a bit of a problem about what I would call myself, because I'm not really quite sure what I want to call myself for the next few interim months while I decide what I do next. But anyway, thank you very much for the collective organisers for agreeing to still let me come, even though I know the initial invitation was very much pitched to me in my role as director of ODI. And ODI's had the real pleasure, actually, of interacting with all of the relevant institutions involved in this conference in different ways over the last number of years. And it's been a real pleasure for us to get more involved, if you like, in the discussions on international development that take place here within Australia, within the wider Asia-Pacific context. So it's very nice to be here and to make some contact face-to-face with members of those organisations. What I've been asked to do is give a bit of an overview, to sort of do a bit of big picture stuff, to provide a frame for some of the panel discussions that are going to happen later through the day. The slight danger of that is that I'm aware there's a fantastic background paper, which I hope if you haven't read already that you do. I commend it to you. It's an extremely good background paper for this conference. So there's just a slight danger that some of the things I'm going to say in an overview will end up being duplicative of what you read in that paper, because many of the things I agree with that are in it. But I will do my best to try and push the envelope in a few places and to maybe come up with slightly different perspectives that will be a little bit of a spur to some of our conversations as we go on. I've called the sort of broad title of what I want to talk about Emergence, Divergence, and Why Poverty Still Matters. Now, I was asked also to focus a little bit on the changing sort of aid architecture, how that we see that from the UK, how it looks specifically in this region, and I will touch on that. But I did want to start off by, in a sense, setting out what I see as the case for continuing international development engagement and development cooperation, not just in this region, but globally, before I talk about some of the challenges that I see as being particularly relevant to development cooperation today. Now, I don't know if many of you will have seen, I hope you have, again, well worth looking at, the latest Human Development Report from UNDP, the 2013 report. And it opens, I think, in a way that really sets the scene for what I want to say in my opening remarks. Let me just quote the opening sentence. One of the most heartening developments in recent years has been the broad progress in human development of many developing countries and their emergence onto the global stage. The rise of the South. I think standing here in Melbourne, on the edge of this vast Asia-Pacific region, it is hard to deny just how remarkable that progress and that emergence has been over the last decade or so. And I'm going to just give you a few facts, which I'm sure now are fairly common currency in the way we talk about progress in international development globally. But let me just share with you a few of those headlines. Projections suggest that there will be, by 2015, 1 billion fewer people living in extreme poverty compared with 1990. Poverty has fallen in 114 of 123 countries since 1990, compared to significant rises in poverty in many countries during the 1960s, the 1970s, and to some extent the 1980s. That is a remarkable story. More than 5 million children have been saved each year compared to 1990. And in 2010, there was a record number of children in the developing world attending primary school. Now, I don't need to tell all of you that a lot of this progress, certainly at the global level, has been driven by trends from within parts of this region, spurred on by deepening trade links, increased volumes of foreign direct investment, particularly investment in knowledge and technology, demographic changes, and a higher proportion of income invested by the leading economies in this region, but also as a result of some smart and strategically important development assistance over time. And I'll come back to how I see the relevance of that and how I see that changing in a while. But it's not only Asia that is emerging. 10 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa ranked amongst the 12 top improvers in the Human Development Index between 2000 and 2011. 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world in 2012 were in Sub-Saharan Africa. Those are not things that we were expecting to hear 10 years ago. I mean, these things roll off our tongue now fairly readily, but they were not messages, headlines that we were using a decade ago. And some of the most remarkable MDG performance, albeit from a very low base in some cases, has actually been seen in Africa. New data, for instance, shows that the rate of decline in child deaths across Sub-Saharan Africa is not only falling at a rate in line with expectations set out by the MDGs, but is actually declining at a faster rate than those expectations set out in the MDG framework. The reduction in child mortality across Africa is really a remarkable story. It's uneven, it's not distributed across all countries in the same way, but there is real evidence of real change and at a rate that is exceeding expectations. Now, some of that story has to do with the generalized effects of growth, improved standards of living, but it also, once you dig deep, has to do with strategic investments in public health, vaccination and basic education, which essentially is reducing the unit cost of saving children's lives. And this story has to do as much with an emerging partnership between traditional development assistance and newer innovative forms of financing and delivery that is very much a feature of development cooperation today. Now, the consequence of this emergence, of this progress, is that we're now seeing a major shift in the geography of growth, of poverty, and increasingly of global priority setting. We talk about the sort of pivot to Asia, the axis of power is on the move, and to a large extent, we see that. I think very really sitting in Melbourne, and I just sort of read the papers and see what's going on. But I think we also see it in terms of the emerging sort of soft power aspirations of a number of emerging economies in the region. The conversations that are now happening amongst the BRICS, for example, about establishing a development bank. That's potentially going to change a number of the things that happen within global cooperation. And we've also seen increasing engagement by a number of countries from this region, India and China most notably, but not exclusively, in Sub-Saharan Africa. And recent data suggests that China in particular has committed something like $70 billion of investment in Africa over the last 10 years, of which only about a third at most could be classified as concessional assistance or aid, but nonetheless, that is an enormous figure. And it is, without question, beginning to shift some of the regional global priorities around the shape of development cooperation. But while we see this emergence, we also see differentiation and a change in the so-called client groups that are the focus of international development assistance. So we have middle-income countries that are some of the fastest growing in the world. We have lower middle-income countries with very large, extremely poor $1.25 populations, and sub-national areas or states that are more similar to low-income countries than they are to middle-income countries. India is a very good example, with states, up to 6 states that have within them more poor people than all of sub-Saharan Africa. We have low-income countries that are facing huge mineral wealth windfalls, but are equally mired in conflict and insecurity. Landlocked and least developed economies and small island states that continue to struggle with the huge constraints to economic integration and high aid dependence. But we're also seeing a shift towards more people living in urban centres, and there being a much larger urban poor population, and the sort of face of poverty is increasingly shifting from a rural face to an urban face. And this reflects not only the massive growth in the big metropolitan cities of the emerging economies, but also an incredible organic growth in small towns and cities across the developing world, where people are making very active choices to locate. And these urban centres, in many ways, creating new poles of emergence within low-income and low-middle-income countries. They also present, of course, a whole range of new challenges. What do we know about urban centres? Well, in many ways, they offer huge dividends for providing services. There's proximity, there's the potential for using technology much more creatively. At the same time, urban centres are bigger emitters of greenhouse gases. They present all kinds of challenges in terms of resilience against disaster risk and so forth, where you have concentrated populations. So on the one hand, this is a remarkable shift, and people opting for improvements in standards of life that go with urbanisation. At the same time, that loads on a whole set of new and potentially quite potent challenges. But emergence also means that poverty is no longer only a low-income country problem. It's fairly old news now to say that we have to confront a different world order in which 3/4, plus or minus, of the world's poor will be living in middle-income countries. I'm going to come back to this. But for now, the global numbers, I think, are pretty compelling in suggesting that we are now in an era where there are going to be more relatively poor people and relatively more poor urban people in a less absolutely poor and less rural poor world. And I think this is a key part of the challenge for how we think about international development engagement within this region, where so many of those trends are happening and colliding all at the same time. There's no question then that progress in reducing poverty remains impressive over the last decade at least. And based on projections of recent trends, what I call the business as usual option, some advocates are now arguing that we face the real prospect of eliminating extreme poverty altogether by 2030. And the World Bank has just set a target for reducing $0.25 poverty to 3% or less by 2030. But talk of progress and emergence is also quite seductive. And I'm just going to pause for one moment and just say, I think we also have to face up to the fact that there is a major existential threat, which I haven't talked about, to much of this progress, which of course is increasing climate variability and climate change. That is the big game changer. It could change much of what we now see as evidence of progress in development over the last decade and more. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that issue because I know it's going to be raised by others later, but it's really important for me to say that because it really does sort of sit there as a serious threat to much of what we know that drives progress in poverty reduction. So I say talk of progress and emergence is also quite seductive. I'm certainly a glass half full person rather than a glass half empty person. But the flip side of progress is the mounting evidence that below the headlines, the brakes are being applied by the growing divergence in incomes, in livelihoods and in aspirations that now characterises our multipolar world. Up until relatively recently, we've been fairly focused on the fact that there are large inequalities between regions and between countries. Many of those are now beginning to close, what some economists call convergence. But as those close, what we're seeing is that inequalities within countries, between sub-regions within countries, between social groups, between women and men, those inequalities have actually become more intense. And when we look at the data on income inequality, there's evidence that that is rising pretty much everywhere. And in cases where it is rising quickly, it is having a braking effect on the extent to which growth can contribute to further poverty reduction. Much of the progress in emerging and developing economies over the last 2 decades has actually been driven by a rising middle, a middle class that has driven consumption growth, driven connectivity, and now has more in common with itself on a global stage than it does with many of the social groups within their own countries. I think it's McKinsey the McKinsey Global Institute has estimated something like there'll be 600 million more members of the middle class in emerging economies by 2025. I mean, this is a huge phenomenon. But not only do we have a rising middle, there's also, at the top of the pyramid, a hyper-elite who are increasingly global, increasingly borderless, and increasingly disconnected from nation-states. By 2030, the so-called South or emerging developing economies will account for 3/5 of the middle class, and a very large percentage of those will be in Asia. But what about the diverging bottom, those sub-regions and income groups and gender groups that are not keeping up with the middle and are in fact losing ground? Branko Milanovic at the World Bank has shown that in some very poor countries, there are millions of people with real incomes that are actually not much higher than they were 200 years ago. The divergence between the top and bottom income earners is no longer something we can politely ignore as a consequence of rapid growth and development. Now, my successor at ODI, who starts in June, Kevin Watkins, who's currently at the Brookings Institute, says there are limits to acceptable disparities, and we have already breached them. So growing inequality, or what Kamel Dervish at Brookings recently called hyper-concentration, is becoming a potential disruptor to progress. And I don't think this region is immune from that. Inequalities, whether they're income-based or between social groups, not only compromises our ability to reach every person with a minimum standard of life, it also compromises whole society efforts to create a sustainable path for the future. And if continued unchecked, could seriously put in jeopardy our combined efforts to date. And if you decompose, which we've done at ODI, where a lot of the progress against the MDGs has come from over the last 10 years, actually over the last 20, because we base it around 1990 data, and you decompose it into different income quartiles, into urban, rural, into women and men, what you find is a lot of that progress is being driven by better off income groups, by progress in urban areas, and in a number of the MDGs, progress amongst men rather than women. So this is really my argument for why poverty still matters. Despite the laudable enthusiasm for getting to zero on extreme poverty by 2030, recent work by Lawrence Chandy at Brookings and Andy Sumner at King's, formerly of IDS in the UK, they show that the feasibility of getting to zero in the post-2015 framework, if you like, is conditioned not only by assumptions of consumption growth, and we could also say it should be conditioned by our assumptions about what's happening in the climate space, but it's also massively conditioned about the assumptions we make about distribution. The success over the last 2 decades has been very much driven by tipping people who were close to the poverty line over the poverty line. And there are fewer and fewer people living close to the poverty line, the absolute poverty line. And what we're left with is those people who are further away from the poverty line, and also a lot of people who are just above it, who are very vulnerable to shocks, to events that can tip them right back. What this is leading some commentators to say in this field is that rising inequality and the distributional caseload, if you like, that we're now potentially facing in continuing to make progress means that even if we could replicate the success of the last 20 years, it will not sustain the trend rate of global poverty reduction that we have seen to date. Depending on which assumptions we make about distribution shifts, there will be a significant poverty challenge that still exists post-2030. And even as extreme poverty falls, we still face the huge job of tackling the challenges faced by the $2 a day poor, the $3 a day poor. These are levels of poverty that are still unimaginable for most of us. As one commentator puts it, today we face a different set of challenges in furthering progress against poverty, which demand a different set of solutions. So what I take away from this is that the business as usual option that I talked about earlier is actually not an option. We can't simply rely on the trajectory of progress of the past to lift all boats in the future. We need to find ways, and here I'm slightly amending a phrase that Jim Kim at the World Bank has used. We need to find ways to bend the curve of progress, to find new ways to reach the hardest to reach, finding solutions to the enduring public goods problems that constrain and limit what poor people can achieve in the economic, social and political sphere, to embrace new forms of knowledge, finance and technology. Finding things that work in the face of rising inequality is in many respects a new challenge for the development community, and one in which we need new and compelling evidence, and quickly. So I'm going to pull this together now in my last 5 minutes. Taken together, the emerging and the diverging stories pose a number of dilemmas or challenges for the post-2015 framework and the high-level panel report, which is due to come out sort of imminently. And I've posed these challenges in terms of a kind of 3 dilemmas, or a trilemma, if you like. And I'm just going to headline them now, and maybe we have an opportunity to talk some of them through during the day. I mean, I think this story of emergence and divergence raises the question of a development framework post-2015 relevant to whom? To everyone? To only the extreme poor? To the bottom 40%? To everyone, to the relatively poor? To the poor wherever they are? Who is this framework relevant for? And I'm hoping that the high-level panel report will help us answer that question, but it remains an issue that we have to tackle. And I think in this region, that's a very pertinent question. The second dilemma is relevant how? Which collective action problems are most amenable to global goal setting? What should be in? What are the priorities that really require global collective action that can be mobilized and motivated through a post-2015 development framework? And what is the right balance between pitching global goals and setting national targets? And these are things that have got to be sorted out. Now, there is some time to do so, but the high-level panel report is going to have to give us a steer on which are the collective action problems that are most amenable and most pertinent to global goal setting. Not everything is. And finally, the other dilemma is, how is the framework going to pitch the emphasis on progress today versus progress in the future? How is it going to reconcile the intertemporal problem and the sustainability challenge, which is fundamental to all that we do in development today? My own view is that the framework will fail if it isn't grounded in some principles, values that are universally recognizable, but it will also fail if it takes the focus away from addressing the continuing challenge of poverty reduction in developing and emerging economies, and does so with the recognition that we are living in an increasingly unequal world. There's a huge opportunity to reposition through the post-2015 process the Global Compact on Development, to be ambitious, to, if you like, reboot international commitment to global collective action. And to some extent, maybe that's the main prize, to kind of repurpose the global effort on poverty reduction. That would be terrific. But of course, there is still a long tail of challenges that are still unmet, unachieved, if you like, where we haven't made enough progress. And what we mustn't do is take our eye off those either. And many of those, that long tail of challenges is about delivering public goods for marginalized, vulnerable, extremely poor people. At the same time, of course, the business of aid, of development cooperation, is also having to face up to an important number of disruptors, if you like, of things that are changing the industry. And I'll just mention a few now. I mean, there is the very obvious fact that bilateral donors, particularly, are facing a very different risk appetite today based on the pressures at home and the need to demonstrate, rightly, but the very real pressure to demonstrate results and value for money. And that's a very real issue in the UK, where on the one hand we have a rising budget in the face of austerity at home, a remarkable achievement for both political leadership and incredible campaigning of civil society organisations over a long period of time. On the other hand, huge public pressure to essentially minimise risk and demonstrate safe results. And that's a real tension, I think. The second is, a large amount of evidence now about what works and why in development, but also real challenges about how to take that and scale it and transfer it to other places. Again, in the UK, we're facing, if you like, a revolution of what evidence in development means. Lawrence might have a view on this also, but something of an obsession, shall I say, with experimental methods, randomized controlled trials, all these kind of methodologies for coming up with evidence about what works. That's great. That's opened up lots of doors, but at the same time, it's also made it very difficult to, A, present alternative forms of evidence and to give it equal weight, but also there is much less evidence on not just what works, but how does it work? And does it work everywhere? And how do you scale it? And those kinds of things are actually presenting, certainly within bilateral aid, I think, quite a lot of tension. And of course, the other big disruptor is the increasing muscularity of recipients, of aid recipients, who have real choice in some cases now over who they work with and who they receive finance from. As I say, we know a great deal more today about what works, but the data, particularly on distribution, also tells us that we can not only rely exclusively on the solutions of old. Development cooperation needs to face the different dynamics that now shape international and regional engagement and work closely with a range of partners with new financial flows that aim for social impact and can add value. In the UK, there's been a lively debate for a number of years now about the focus of development assistance. The official target until relatively recently was that the Department for International Development should allocate 90% of its aid towards low-income countries, towards poor countries, where the majority of poor people were once. That's obviously moved. But actually, what's quite interesting is that if you look at where UK aid is currently allocated, the percentage of it going to low-income countries proper has declined in the last few years, from around 80% to 65%. And what's happening instead is that the volumes of aid that are going to lower middle-income countries like Nigeria and Pakistan has grown enormously. Now, when challenged on this, the department will say, well, hold on a minute, we never meant to apply the low-income country rule mechanically, and we've got to face up to the fact that a number of our key partner countries with very significant poverty and MDG burdens still in place are now technically lower middle income countries. But I think what that shows is that the sort of low income versus middle income country cutoff that became something of a sort of leitmotif in the press within the UK about where UK aid should go. So we shouldn't fund India, we mustn't fund China. They have space programs, they can host the Olympics. What it shows is actually it's a lot more complex than that. And as we confront this changing world, what we have to recognize is that if we're concerned about poverty reduction, we have to go where poor people are. And many of them are increasingly in lower middle income countries. So for me personally, and I've said this publicly in the UK, the low-income country, middle-income country approach has been pretty arbitrary, actually. And on a case-by-case basis, there are strong, compelling reasons to continue development assistance to some lower middle-income countries particularly, guided by two things. First is the continuing under-provision of public goods in those countries, particularly for poor people. And secondly, by the fact that some of the best social and arguably environmental returns to investment lie in those countries. So if you care about value for money, often providing aid in those countries is the place to go. And of course, you can never take the geopolitics fully out of decision where to allocate bilateral aid. What is clear, however, whether we're talking low-income or middle-income countries, is that aid cannot do it by itself. And there is increasing choice of the type of financing that developing economies can access for development. Some of that finance actively working outside the traditional aid idiom, whether it's big philanthropy to non-traditional sources of development cooperation or to social impact investors. Recent work at ODI conservatively estimated that these sources taken together, these non-traditional sources, could be now as much as 30% of flows to developing economies, up from 8% in 2000. But of course there are challenges. The global architecture is getting increasingly crowded. Recipients are faced with a complex range of choices, sometimes not quite sure what they're choosing between. Not all finance is equal. We can talk more about that later. Some comes with very different deals attached, and many recipients need support in making the right choices. And the fact that many countries now facing choice actually lack the market or government infrastructure to take full advantage of the range of innovative sources available to them is a real problem. And tackling poverty must remain, in my view, the guiding focus for ODA. Packaging ODA, however, with other sources of finance can broaden the field of action and allow for new and, in some cases, more innovative solutions to the collective action problems that define much of the development problem. I don't think this requires us to redefine ODA. There is an active debate at the moment amongst the OECD countries about whether or not in this changing world, in a post-2015 world, we will need to redefine ODA. I'm not entirely convinced of that. But I do think ODA needs to work much more creatively, much more ingeniously alongside other forms of finance. And it needs to sort of leverage and catalyze new financial solutions that appeal to recipients. And there are particular areas, and I was talking to Warren Evans last night about that, I think in climate, where that is particularly needed. Nowhere is this likely to be more important than in this region, which is home to 4 of the top recipients of global ODA, but also 6 of the top 10 recipients of remittance income and 4 of the top 10 recipients of FDI, as well as, of course, some of the leading suppliers of so-called non-traditional development assistance. It goes without saying that financing and development solutions of the future need to take these realities into account. So my final words. In Busan, at the 4th High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness, we were offered the promise of a more inclusive global partnership for effective development, a framework for development effectiveness that was in line with the changing world and that opted, if you like, to broaden the tent, to have more players around the table at the cost of essentially losing some of the technical agenda that underpinned Paris and the Accra Agenda for Action. As it is, the Global Partnership for Effective Development has to some extent been overtaken by events, and this is not to undermine its purposes, but we are already seeing recipients voting with their feet, making choices on development partners which would not necessarily have happened even 5 years ago. Cases recently in Cambodia, and of course the flip side of the India story of the UK exiting from India is high-level politicians in India saying, we're not really sure we want your aid anyway. In this context, traditional development partners need to quickly work out their offer. For my money, that lies in bringing creativity, ingenuity, and a bit of risk-taking to the challenge of solving shared problems for poverty reduction. But poverty reduction in a context of sustainability and fundamentally ensuring prosperity for all, which requires seeing poverty reduction in the context of reducing inequality also. I'll leave it there. Thank you.